Now, if you've seen the surf film before, I know what you're probably thinking, but this isn't that kind of documentary. First, I want you to ask yourself, what do I have to learn about surfboards? But wait, it's pretty simple, isn't it? Well, then I have to ask you this. Do you know why a surfboard is shaped the way it is? Or how the nose, tail, rocker, or bottom contour affect the surfboard? Well, if the answer is no to either of those questions, then I'll suggest that you stick around for a bit and find out the answer. If the answer is yes, well, then you can just sit back, watch some sick edits, and you might learn something you didn't expect to. Now, to answer your first question, what could I learn about surfing? Well, I gotta tell you, there's a lot. Being able to surf is one thing, but knowing how and why a surfboard is shaped the way it is, and knowing that well enough to create surfboards good enough to ride, is an art form. Well, when it comes to importance, the very first thing you have to know is what kind of board you want. With so many options in the market, it can get pretty confusing, but here's some general rules to follow. A shortboard is more than likely for intermediate and advanced surfers. It has less volume, a pointed nose, thinner rails, and is made for faster and more powerful waves, allowing surfers to have maximum maneuverability, but at the slight cost of wave catchability. Next, a fish. With a pointed nose and most notably a swallowtail, they tend to have more volume and buoyancy, and pair that with the flatter rocker, and they paddle pretty darn well, allowing you to catch more waves and get more out of smaller days. Finally, we have longboards, one of the most iconic shapes and the most ideal for beginners. Being long, wide, and with tons of volume underneath you, the board gives lots of stability with much faster paddle speeds, and the ability to catch just about any wave you see. After discussing the kinds of boards, let's talk about what the outline of a board does. For this, we'll start with the front half of the board and get back to the back here in a few minutes. The front of the board has the biggest influence while paddling, and this is because this is when our weight is over the front of the board, as once we are on our feet, we are mostly behind the midway point. The front is also the first place that our board makes contact with the water. In the same way that a car or plane needs to move through the air with the least amount of drag, so does a surfboard. From the nose to tail, the board acts as a hydrodynamic foil. So we need to look at how the board is affecting the water flow as it is moving. The good thing about having a surfboard with a nice, sharp nose is that without as much material up front, there is less swing weight, allowing the board to make sharper and faster turns with less energy on our end. It also means that the board is less likely to catch a rail during turns. The downside, however, is that with less surfboard and volume and buoyancy, there is not as much to lift our body out of the water, increasing the overall drag and causing lower paddle speeds. We have to make up for this when selecting the wave that we go for, by taking off on a steeper portion of the wave where the gravitational potential energy can be converted to kinetic energy faster. In contrast, a board with a wide nose and a lot of volume can provide more lift, making it less necessary to compensate with steeper waves. This is why longboarders can sit so much further out than shortboarders can and still catch more waves. Now that we've established what the front of the outline does, let's look at the back. Except for nose riding, while up and riding, the majority of your body is positioned over the midpoint or behind. So we can safely say that the rear half of the surfboard is most in use after the pop-up, and during any maneuver a surfer might want to try. Whether that be wanting to do a cutback or wanting to get barreled, we need to understand how this part of the board will affect us. The back of the board acts like a wing, and the bigger a wing, the more lift it will create. So if we widen the back of the board, the maximum potential for speed is increased and the drag is reduced because it will take a lower speed for the board to lift and skim across the surface of the water. So why don't all boards have wide tails? This is because with too much speed, a board could lose traction in a wave. So in waves where we might expect the board to be designed to go as fast as possible, we see that we normally use boards with narrower tails. After all, the wave itself will provide all of the necessary speed. But the speed is only the first half of the pie. We also want maneuverability, and speed and maneuverability have an inverse relationship. When you improve one, you generally compromise the other. To increase maneuverability, by pulling the outline of the tail, we can make it much easier for the surfer to release the engaged rail, encouraging smooth transition between turns. With a pretty solid idea of how you want the outline of your board to look, let's talk about what your board looks like from the side. If you'll notice that most boards have this kind of banana shape to them, and this banana shape in the board is what we call rocker. Rocker is basically what gives your board a lot of its capabilities, but for now we'll split it into two sections, the nose and tail rocker.
The nose rocker has a direct relationship with the face of the wave, and this means that in a steeper wave you want more nose rocker so the board can fit into the wave when you're dropping into or re-entering from top turns. Since you have a lot of speed anyway, from the larger waves, the extra rocker can help you slow down because the water is hitting the bottom of the board more head on. Now, the tail rocker, however, has an inverse relationship with the curvature of the wave. And a good way to think about this is that there's kind of like an ideal amount of board that you want in contact with the wave at all times, and the tail rocker is what you can use to control that. And so, on a softer wave, where there's a lot of contact with the board, we want to increase the rocker to help reduce the contact. And the opposite conditions with a super steep face, there's not much contact with the board naturally, so we want to increase the amount of contact in the wave by giving the board less rocker in the tail. Next, we will be talking about bottom contours. If this topic is new to you, simply put it is the shaping of the underside of the surfboard. And due to this shape and something called the Quanda effect, the water will follow the bottom of the board even when the surface curves away from the initial flow direction. Now, how does this affect the way the board flows over the water? Well, to start, we should envision the bottom of the board like a riverbed. If there is a rock in the middle of the riverbed, it's going to deflect off of it. We use these principles to get the water to do what we want it to on our surfboards, whether that be to give the board more speed or more maneuverability. Broadly speaking though, there are a handful of different types of bottom contours. The first that we will start with is a single concave. This is a channel that runs from the nose to the tail of the board, funneling all water towards the center, allowing for the board to have more straight line speed because of the added lift it provides. This also allows the board to have a lot of hold on the face of the wave. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, there's the convex bottom. This, instead of having a channel, has more of a belly, so that way as water flows underneath it, it will be deflected out from the center point to the sides, greatly improving maneuverability because of the fulcrum that it allows your foot to push off of. But, in turn, it also produces much more frontal drag, decreasing the speed at which the board can travel. Very similar to this is a V contour, but instead of being rounded off, it just comes to a point. Then there is the flat bottom. This is not so much of a contour, but the lack of a contour. Next, we have the double concave. This is similar to the single concave in that it'll force water towards the center of each concave, but because of the V point in the middle, it'll have a better rail-to-rail response during a turn. Finally, there are channels, producing a similar and potentially stronger effect than a concave contour, but with a more angular design, and they're found mostly on the tail of the board and aid in speed generation by directing water out the back of the board. They also act similar to a center fin by helping prevent the tail from slipping out, causing a loss in forward motion. Using the different types of contours on different parts of the boards, we can make an almost infinite number of combinations to be used. Now, a big part of how your board performs has to do with the rails. The three main kinds of rails are a 50-50, a 60-40, and then a hard edge. These perform in different ways. Starting with the 50-50, it's the most forgiving and most commonly used at the front of the board or while longboarding when you are trying to nose ride. It helps with this because it allows the tail of the board to dig into the wave. Next is a 60-40 and a hard edge. These allow you to use a rail to help bite down on the face of the wave when you're pumping or turning, giving you kind of like a ledge to push off of. With how the surfboard looks established, let's focus on something that has become increasingly more popular, and that is to know how much volume your board has. Volume is the amount of space your board takes up. Generally being represented by liters, really what volume represents though is buoyancy, and therefore how much the board will keep you above the water. If your board is keeping you higher out of the water, you will also create less drag on the water as you paddle, and you'll be able to both catch more waves and catch them earlier when they are less steep. Whoa, that was a lot of information, and to be honest, my brain is a bit fried. But to cap it all off, let's talk about why all this is important for both the locals and the kooks. You see, there are a lot of boards out there, and especially for the everyday surfer, it can be a lot to choose from. But if everyone is informed and buys what is best for their use cases, then we can save a lot of material and money from being wasted from buying and producing the wrong boards, in turn helping both the consumers and producers. So I thoroughly encourage you to do some digging on your own before going out and buying your next blade. Thanks for watching, and always stay stoked.